Hello, biology students. We're going to continue on with photosynthesis today. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the lab that we did last week. And remember you looked at the stomata on both the top side and the underside of the leaf. And you should have seen some different results. First of all, you should have seen that on the underside of the leaf, hopefully you saw lots of these stomata, which function for gas exchange. And when you looked at the top part of the leaf, it was pretty hard to find any. Like some of you didn't find any, some of you found a few, but mostly it was pretty difficult to find them on the top side of the leaf. That's why I wanted you to look at the bottom first so that you could see kind of what you were looking for on that top side. So why is that? Well, remember, in that process of photosynthesis, so we have chlorophyll in the leaves, you know, the leaf, the pores take in, carbon dioxide that goes into the leaf. And then, of course, we have some water that goes in, not really through the leaves. The water really goes in, it's, as we said here, down from the roots and then gets carried up through the tissues into the leaves. And of course, we need sunlight for this process as well. And then in this magical process of photosynthesis, oxygen is produced and given off, and that comes out through the pores, through those stomata, sometimes called stoma. And so we have this carbon dioxide going in through the pores and then oxygen gas coming out through the pores, but we also have some water leaving through the pores. So the reason that we see on most plants, most of those stomata are on the bottom is because think of if a plant is sitting out in the sunlight, absorbing that energy from the sunlight in that process of photosynthesis, the top of the leaf is actually also warmer, and so plants might, in that warmer sunlight, might actually lose too much water vapor, and that can really be a problem. So as a mechanism to kind of conserve how much water is lost through those pores, plants have evolved to have more of those stomata on the bottom where they are in the shade, and they are less likely to lose large amounts of water. So the other thing that you had to do for the lab was to draw a picture of a stomata, including those guard cells. So here's what happens. So these are the leaves that we looked at. Remember I said they weren't like the onion cells where they were very box-like. They were maybe a little box-like, but they were kind of more variable and a little more, I don't know, just not long and thin like the onion cells anyway. And then nestled in between some of these cells were the stomata. And the stomata really are made up of two guard cells that control the opening. So the center is this opening. When the guard cells are well hydrated, they're plump. They kind of plump up and it sort of forces the stomata open. So when a plant is not well, doesn't have enough water, not well hydrated, a little plasmosis or wilting, then these guard cells kind of like an inner tube that you let the air out of it they kind of go flat. And when they go flat, it kind of causes this stomata to close. So you should have drawn something like this anyway. That's kind of what we're looking at. So I want to again continue on with that process of photosynthesis. We talked about light reactions, light dependent reactions, and then we talked about light independent, or sometimes called dark reactions. So any time we're talking about light dependent reactions, we're always talking about capturing energy from the sunlight. And of course this happens in the chloroplast. We said specifically in that thylakoid membrane. Remember the thylakoid, or the little green pancake shaped things we talked about last week. So light-independent reactions are all about capturing the energy from the sun. Then light-independent, and I want you to write this in your notes. This is, I think, a good little visual right here. The second step then are those light-independent reactions. They're sometimes called dark reactions, but they really don't have to happen in the dark. But they're just not dependent on sunlight. So this is actually where the glucose is made. So the chloroplasts store that energy from the sunlight in some kind of temporary molecules, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then in the light-independent reactions is actually where that glucose is made. So we can take that process of photosynthesis and really break it down into 2 steps. I'm going to continue on. Please pause this if you need time to write that down. So I'm going to break photosynthesis down into 2 steps. We're going to talk about the light-dependent reactions and then the light-independent reactions. So in the light-dependent reactions, it's the set of reactions that convert light energy into chemical energy, and we already kind of mentioned that. The first stage converts sunlight into electrical energy. This is also called the electron transport chain. All those electrons that exist in the atoms that make up molecules are little bursts of energy, if you could think of it kind of that way. And so that electron transport chain is all about carrying energy from sunlight, which the sunlight excites the electrons in the chlorophyll. It energizes them, if you will, and that energy is stored in some molecules. The second part of the light-dependent reactions, so we're still talking about light-dependent reactions. The second stage converts some of that electrical energy into chemical energy that's stored in chemical bonds. All molecules store energy in their bonds. So just like when you eat food, the reason you get energy from food is because the processes in your body break down the food, and as it breaks down the food, the energy that's stored in the bonds that hold the food together are released into your body. And your cells have really crazy, miraculous ways of harvesting that energy and converting it into a usable form of energy that it can store and use later. And that's that ATP. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about cellular respiration in a little bit. So that second stage, converts that chemical energy into some, it stores it into some chemical energy and chemical bonds. So actually in photosynthesis, we do get a little bit of ATP made, but you don't have to write these down. That's why I have them crossed out, but I want to remember to talk about them. And then NADPH is another one. And just a vocabulary word that I think is important, a photosystem. And there's a couple of different photosystems that exist. A photosystem is just a unit of a whole bunch of these chlorophyll molecules and carrier molecules that are all kind of linked together and work together. So that's what a photosystem is. And then chemoosmosis is diffusion of chemicals through a membrane. Remember, we talked about what osmosis was, and I'm sure most of you remember that. Osmosis is movement of water through a membrane. But sometimes, as in the process of photosynthesis, other things kind of diffuse through the membrane, and actually it drives the production of ATP formation because there's an enzyme called ATP synthase that exists in that membrane. So the light-dependent reactions, again, were all about taking energy from sunlight and making some molecules that stored that energy. The light-independent reaction, also called the Calvin cycle, because some really smart guy named Calvin kind of figured this out. So light-independent reactions just don't depend on sunlight. Again, we sometimes refer to them as dark reactions, but they don't have to happen in the dark, so that was kind of misleading. Light-independent reactions, this is where that glucose is made. We said plants make their own food from energy from the sunlight, and so that glucose is made in the Calvin cycle and the light-independent reactions. The reactions that form organic compounds like glucose. Glucose is an organic compound. By using energy stored during those light-dependent reactions. And again, that NADPH and that ATP, again, it's not dependent on light. They don't necessarily occur in the dark. This is, I would say this is maybe not entirely true. They can occur in the dark, but a lot of times they occur simultaneously as at the same time that the light-dependent reactions are going on. And then a term we use, carbon fixation. We say carbon is fixed in this cycle. Well, it wasn't broken. That's not what it means. It means that it's, by fixing it, it means it's converted from one form to another. So carbon dioxide is, the carbon in the carbon dioxide is going to be converted into glucose, which remember is a sugar containing carbon. It's a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen compound. So that's where the carbon from carbon dioxide ends up. And we call that carbon fixation. And again, the Calvin cycle is a chemical process that converts CO2 into glucose by using energy stored in those chemical bonds. And then there's a couple of other carbon fixing pathways that some plants have, but not all plants have. And we have plants that grow in a variety of different environments. So think about some of the adaptations, for example, of plants that grow in really high temperatures. So there's something called the C4 pathway, which is a carbon fixing pathway in which carbon dioxide is bound to a compound to form a 4-carbon intermediate molecule before it enters the carbon cycle. And this actually allows plants that grow in high temperatures with lots of sunlight, it allows them to fix carbon at a higher rate. So one type of plant that has this C4 pathway are grasses, which includes corn, which is technically a grass. And then another type of pathway, a CAM pathway. So plants found in areas where it's hot and dry. So this allows plants to take in CO2 at night, so it's not opening those stomata during the day when it's so hot, so it reduces water loss that way. And then it releases CO2 during the day into that Calvin cycle. This allows plants to keep pores closed during the hot daytime, as I said. So think for a moment, what kind of plants do you think might have the CAM pathway? Yeah, anything that grows in a desert, cactus, those really need to conserve water. What other ways do desert plants conserve water? What other mechanisms do they have other than this CAM pathway that allow them to reduce water loss? So think about that for a moment. Think about the specialized things that those desert plants have. And then just really quickly, there's a few things that affect the rate of photosynthesis, like temperature. If the temperature is higher, typically photosynthesis rates are increased. Most chemical reactions increase with increased temperature. Do you think there might be a limit there as to how hot? Think about that for a moment. Light intensity, more light would increase the rate of photosynthesis. pH has a huge effect on living things, plants and animals. So plants also have to have an optimum range of pH for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide. If there's more carbon dioxide gas, it would only make sense that there would be an increased rate of photosynthesis as long as there's ample water and sunlight. Again, water, as long as there's enough water and enough of everything else, water is necessary for that process, so more water would increase the rate of photosynthesis. And then soil nutrition has a huge effect on chlorophyll